which means they create more need, which means more people get an opportunity. It's all about the multiplier effect. And the diaspora is a critical part in that. It's a critical part that, frankly, is just not tapped yet. People understanding the transfer monies. You know, now you're setting all sorts of inexpensive, very competitive ways of transferring monies back to family. But the next step is, how do you transfer into businesses, into investments? That's something I'm really looking at. We don't have an answer to it yet, but we're really focused on that.
Most of the time, the problem is, what are the right businesses to invest in? So as an entrepreneur, because our focus on this show, on this program, the Diaspora Today show, is to help empower entrepreneurs, to give them the right resources they need to grow. As an entrepreneur, Dr. Mima, what can you tell me the way to success?
You know, if you look historically and come back to the population rise and urbanization, fewer and fewer people are now farmers. They're moving to the cities, right? Fewer and fewer people go in the villages and buying bulk food. They're going to the grocery store or the local market to be buying the packaged foods. Most historically, if you look, you know, because the Asia tigers is an exception, it's not the norm. Most industry tradition is built up of light industry. And what is light industry is some sort of food process, food packaging, because we all got to eat, right? So it's the basic products industry, whether it's some simple basic packaging of food, and keeping in mind that we're not more than half going to be urban. We're not going to have our farms. We're going to be going to the store to buy our food. Well, that food is going to be packaged, processed, set up in some way, right? There's that whole, we call from farm to fork. At some point, I think with a study with the Rockefeller Foundation, like 17 different specializations along the way. All kinds of sub-industries there. Those are where the opportunities are. The other is basic products. I mean, does everything need to come from China? Of course not. You can start doing your basic production of shoes, clothing items. I mean, this is what we need in the end. We have to eat, we have to clothe ourselves. So let's start with there, okay? The other parts become that, you know, that sort of, like I keep saying, spending class, because I don't, you know, there's such a diversion of discussions over defining middle class. What does it mean? So I prefer not to use the term middle class because it's different in different places. I say spending class for me is somebody has an extra $1, $2, $3, increasing. Next day they have $5 extra they can spend on something beyond just survival. What do I spend it on? This is why you're seeing a lot of, you know, sort of even some of the industry, in the beverage industry, people want maybe the juices, or maybe some of the alcoholic, you know, beers. What are the big growth? You know, you're getting people coming into higher value food product, protein consumption. One of the biggest growth industries is poultry. And the various poultry sort of sub-products, be it eggs or different poultry products. Why? Because people are eating more protein. You have more money in your pocket, you want to eat better. What does that mean? That usually means protein. If that's poultry, if that's fish, well, what is poultry and fish? Poultry and fish is basically a very efficient transformer of grain into protein. So that means somebody's got to do the soy and the maize. That becomes a feed product. That's another business. So you can just keep working yourself up and down the chain, but I would say focus on those two areas. Well, people will spend the first $5 on. It's going to be better food, better clothing, better personal products, personal product lines, any of those issues. It's the consumer base.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Mima, for talking to me today on the Diaspora Today show. My viewers from across the world will continue to explore other opportunities from world leaders and CEOs of international organizations, non-for-profit organizations from across the world to help enlighten and empower our young entrepreneurs, small business owners from all across the African continent. Thank you once again, and my name is Abdul Rashid Abubakar. Till next time we meet, I say bye.
Hello, my name is David. Where are you from? I want to know. Is it the east or west side? Anywhere you talk, I want to go. Anything you want, I'll give you all. Even if it's still around the globe. 'Cause I've been around the world and I've seen a lot of girls.
Welcome to the Diaspora Today show. I'm your host, and my name is Abdul Rashid Abubakar. We are one-on-one here today with one of Africa's brightest, successful, and well-respected in the world. I'm talking about Jean Abin Nader, the Executive Director, Moroccan American Trade and Investment Center, an international business advisory. Hello, welcome to the show today.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you.
Can you tell us down memory line how it all started?
That's a really good question, because in some ways it's almost a model for how to build good, strong bilateral relationships. In 2003, Mohammed VI, who was the King of Morocco since 1999, when he succeeded his father Hassan II, came to the United States and visited with President George W. Bush. The idea was, how can we build stronger relationships between Morocco, which was the first country to recognize the United States back in 1777, and the United States, which, as you know, is the world's most powerful country. And out of this discussion came the idea of having a free trade agreement between Morocco and the United States. And so the negotiations began, and in 2006, it came into force. What was really interesting about the free trade agreement is that it had a component encouraging Morocco to develop relations with the AGOA countries in terms of exports to the United States. In other words, if the textile industry in Morocco sourced a certain percentage of yarn and cotton and buttons and things like that from the AGOA countries, they could enter the United States duty-free. And so that was the first recognition from the American side that Morocco really was a player in Africa and someone with whom they could work to develop America's presence throughout the continent.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Diaspora Today show on Center Africa TV and Victory One TV. I hope you all enjoy today's show. With me today I have a brilliant individual, Mr. Gabriel Joshua Christian, U.S. attorney, educator, historian, and an African diaspora development activist. Welcome, Mr. Christian.
Thank you, Brother Abdul. It's a pleasure to be with you. You're a great son of Africa, and we're all proud of your effort to enlighten us about matters in Africa and the African diaspora.
Thank you. Welcome. Can you tell us from the beginning, how did you become an African diaspora development activist?
I think we're all products of our time, and we are all shaped by the environment and the world within which we grew up. So I was born in Dominica in 1961, right? That is right around the time John F. Kennedy became president of the United States, right around the time Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement started developing, right around the time Ghana came into the news 3 years or 4 years earlier. It's 57, it became independent.
Right.
Right 1 year after Nigeria, your country birth. Right. I think Nnamdi Ezekwe was the first president of Nigeria. Nigeria became independent of Britain. So Dominica was still a colony of Britain. So we were there in North America, right next to the United States, a society that had been formed by Africans, people who had come from Nigeria, Ghana and other places, who had been taken, brought to the Caribbean, like Dominica, to grow sugarcane to provide wealth for Britain. And we were beginning to assert our self-determination in the same way Nigerians, Ghanaians, Senegalese, Algerians had begun to assert their self-determination. And so as a child, I began to hear the stories of Patrice Lumumba, Nnamdi Ezekwe, and I never forget, as a child, when the Biafran War took place, in Biafra, of course, you had Ojukwu, yes, and in Nigeria you had Yakubu Gowon. I remember clearly it was being discussed at our dinner table. My father had been in the British Army, he'd served, he'd been a member of the London Book Club since 1930. We had lots of books in our library, and there was also the Rosewood Public Library that I would visit and read Time magazine and Music magazine about the Civil War. I didn't know all the intricacies of the Civil War, but as I grew older, I could understand. And those things concerned me because as a person of color, someone who had roots in Africa, we wanted to understand how it is we had ended up in the Caribbean. What was going on in Africa? What could we do to better our condition in the Caribbean and in Africa? And of course, then you had the music of the time. James Brown, the famous African-American singer, sang the song, "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud." So we also began to get prideful about our condition as African people, people of color. We before were made to think or less than. Now we were very proud to be African. And so people started using African names like Kobe, like Kwame, like Suleiman, and all the things that could relate in their mind a sense of African consciousness. And we started supporting the liberation movement in Angola, the liberation movement in Mozambique, the liberation movement in Guinea-Bissau, because we wanted those countries to be free of Portuguese colonial rule. At the same time, in the United States, because we're an English-speaking North American territory, in places like Jamaica, you had Bob Marley with songs like Africans Unite. He said, "What a beautiful thing it would be before God and man to see the unification of all Africans."
Wow.
Wonderful, powerful song. So that was my generation. And those ideas, that music, that conditioning shaped me into becoming concerned about Africa, not in the abstract, but about its development. So its science, its technology, its industry could be used for the benefit of Africans at home and abroad.
Thank you, Mr. Christian. That was fantastic. So how would you like to see the African diaspora move forward?
Well, I think the African Union has the right idea. I think Africans overseas, as well as Africans at home, should unite in common endeavor. I was mentioning before we started speaking this morning that when the Ebola crisis took place, the country in the world that gave the most assistance was a country that had a huge African diaspora, and that was Cuba. They had a lot of doctors, and they sent a lot of doctors to Sierra Leone.
Yeah, that was true.
But I would like to see in the AU also call on all the African countries to set up a laboratory protocol. So you'd have a continental laboratory network. So laboratories for medical research in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Angola, in South Africa could work on a daily, weekly, monthly basis to exchange data and work on issues like malaria, tsetse fly disease, sleeping sickness, Ebola, other infectious diseases that affect the African population from an Afrocentric standpoint. I don't mean it in an ethnocentric way, because science is science, but we have to develop our internal capacity in Africa to deal with those things so that Africa is not totally dependent on outside resources. Now, the outside resources, whether it's African diaspora resources, or be it European or be it Chinese, we have to relate. I mean, I'm not trying to be exclusionary. Sometimes in thinking about African development, sometimes people have a mistaken belief that we should live in the past and be concerned about what happened to us in the past. What happened in the past, like slavery, like colonialism, it happened. We have to learn from our mistakes. But I think the more important thing is what's happening now that we can do to unite our efforts, unite our resources in science and technology, so we can have entrepreneurship, so we can actually take control of our destiny. Just like what you're doing now. And nobody gave you a huge pot of gold to set up your network, but you saw the need to educate our population, and you're doing a fine job.
Thank you, Mr. Christian.
Absolutely.
You are also doing a great job
together.
To be active, an activist, to be in the forefront, to enlighten and to liberate, our African brothers in the diaspora. Thank you on that note. So where do you see the American-African relations, since President Trump has now made it, his priority, for his political agenda, to prioritize African country?
Yes, President Trump is an interesting person. He did have a meeting at the White House with the presidents of the historically black colleges and universities. So when the Civil War ended and Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, those who were abolitionists and who supported freedom for African Americans, white and black, got together and did develop universities like Fisk University, Howard University, the University of Maryland, Eastern Shore, and many universities, in fact a total of 126 universities all across the United States, focused on agriculture, industry, literature, sciences, and so on. The great African American educator, Booker T. Washington, set up Tuskegee Institute, which is now Tuskegee University. So the President Trump, brought those presidents in because he claimed that he would be putting federal government support behind the development of those institutions. We are not certain at this point in time how much of that commitment is real and how much of it is simply for political presentation, but we are very hopeful that he commits to his word indeed. But I am more concerned about what it is we are doing. I believe that the future of the African development process resides in education. And that means we have to partner our universities in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Angola, with the universities in the African diaspora.
I think that is already going on.
Not at the level that it should. I believe we need to have, for instance, in every African country, using distance learning, which is what this is. This is a form of distance learning because this video will be seen all over the world. Partnerships that would allow, for instance, professors who have the competence in, let's say, informatics in Washington to communicate that message to students in Senegal, to students in Algeria, students in Angola, in Kenya. We need to be able to see those things happening now because many of the students in those areas may not have the money to fly over to the United States and pay for a U.S. education. However, if we can bring the education to them via distance learning, or by setting up satellite campuses in country in partnership and have exchanges on a regular basis, then we can increase the competence in the arts and sciences of our
just like we have it now in Qatar. I was in Doha, a couple of times, and I see they have the George Washington University satellite campus.
It's interesting. I've been in 2009. I was a guest of Sheikh Al Thani, Sheikh Moza, for the World Innovation Summit in Education, as a founder of the Dome Decker Academy of Arts and Sciences. And I visited, it's on YouTube somewhere, I visited the University City, where they have Carnegie Mellon.
Yes, they have
They have Virginia Commonwealth.
They have the Qatar Foundation.
Qatar Foundation is funding all this. They have Georgetown.
Right, Georgetown.
I'm not sure if they have Oxford, but that's the plan that they have.
Yes.
So they have the city, and then all these U.S. universities are in Qatar.
So if African countries can
do the same thing.
So now, I want us to go back. I want you to backtrack for me a little bit because I want you to focus more on the U.S. African foreign policy.
Yes.
Trump's predecessor, President Barack Obama, was very engaged with African countries.
Yes.
And in the African continent.
Yes.
But Trump said no to that. And most importantly, that his Muslim, immigration ban has now been in,
I
effect.
think, but let me just say this. I think that's short-sighted. And you have to understand the beauty of the United States. The United States is not a perfect country, but is that at least there's a division between the executive branch, judicial branch, and the legislative branch. So you see that he brought out his policy, and so far at the judicial level, it's been denied on several occasions. That's wonderful because basically the court's basic response was that was prejudicial.
True.
The United States Constitution permits freedom of religion,
right?
And they saw it as a abridgment or an infringement rather of that right, freedom to religion. That you're targeting a particular religion to exclude, or people from particular countries where Islam is practiced, to exclude them. The courts were able to assert their independence, and that is good for the United States.
So, as a lawyer,
yes.
So, what is your take?
My take is exactly what the court said, that you cannot, we're all concerned about terrorism, but you cannot just blanket condemn a whole religion, because all you do actually is help the terrorists, because now people can look at it and say, oh, you're a prejudiced person. Look at what you're doing. And I think the courts were very wise. He has to narrow the scope and say, I have actionable evidence that people from this particular location are engaged in plans that are contrary to the U.S. national security, and deal with it on that basis. But when you just make a blanket statement against Islam, all you do is you create sentiments that are antagonistic and tensions between Christians and Muslims that leads to no good end.
And it's unnecessary.
Oh, totally unnecessary. In fact, it's, I believe, contrary to U.S. national security interests, because the majority of people in Islamic countries do not support Al-Qaeda. The majority of people in Islamic countries do not support ISIS.
Likewise, the Quran does not support their doctrine, whatever ISIS stand for and whatever, ISIL stand for. The Quran does not support that.
It's almost as if you're saying that average Christians support the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan's symbol was what? The burning cross.
Yes.
The burning cross. Are you going to blame Christians and say, I'm not going to let Christians come into any country because you know what? The Klan, is a Christian organization. And they're an extremist organization, so all Christians are extremists. I think that's simplistic in the extreme.
Thank you, Mr. Christian. And as an attorney, I want to push you a little bit on what is going on now in the Middle East.
Yes.
Between the Emirates, UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. Yes. What do you have to say to that?
Well, it's very unfortunate, first of all, that the Arab brothers and sisters are divided. I have been to Qatar as a guest of Sheikh Hamoza and Sheikh Al Thani, and I've been to Saudi as a guest of the royal family, Princess Madawi. In 2010, we went to Riyadh. They wanted to set up a non-profit here for education, and I'd known Colonel Al-Rakaf, the Major Al-Rakaf at the embassy. Was one of my clients is an Emir Sheikh Salim Diaby, who's fluent in Arabic, and he used to do the Hajj for the embassy. So they knew him, and he gave them my information, and I was happy to have been there. And I think the future of the Gulf, the future of the Arab world requires a degree of diplomacy that avoids confrontation, because one of the things that you see happening is where the Arab world cannot unite on principle that focuses on non-interference in the internal affairs of the respective countries and cooperation, then you find this sort of civil war as between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and within Libya you have maybe Qatar supporting one side, and Egypt and Saudi supporting the other side. And
in Syria, we see America supporting one side, Russia supporting the other side.
And who's suffering? They say the Ummah, the people in the street, the ordinary person of Muslim persuasion. They're the ones who are suffering. Their country is being destroyed. The infrastructure is being destroyed. The cities, Aleppo, the history, Palmyra, the crime, Mosul. That mosque has been there for 1,000 years, destroyed. It's just, when I look at it, I say to myself, people are not thinking. They've gone mad. So the fact is, whatever Qatar may have done, I think I think they can make criticism also of Saudi Arabia. I think they need to find some.
And they can make criticism of United Arab Emirates.
Absolutely, because in those countries there are people who supported extremism as well. One can make criticism of the United States. When I was in at Georgetown University Law Center, the first war was coming out, the first Gulf War. I'm supposed to be studying for my bar exam. I found myself downtown in a demonstration against the war. It's not because I agreed that Saddam Hussein should have gone into Kuwait, but I felt that we had to give the United Nations a little more time. We should try to get him to withdraw, because I felt that once the war started, it would open up a Pandora's box, and it would lead to endless war in the Middle East. Our worst fears have come to pass. Since that war in 1991, that area of the world has been in constant turmoil, and as a result, you've seen the growth of extremist organizations like Al-Qaeda, ISIS. Sometimes we need to be able to find